The town of Black Hollow was a forgotten place, a dot on the map overshadowed by the Appalachians' towering peaks. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and nothing ever changed. At least, until the first sighting. I had always thought myself a skeptic. As a journalist for the Black Hollow Gazette, my days were spent debunking local myths or chasing leads on what passed for news in our sleepy town. But when Evelyn burst into the office that morning, clutching a Polaroid and stammering about red eyes in the fog, I knew something was different. "Caleb," she gasped, dropping the photo onto my desk. Her hands trembled so violently I could barely make out the image. "You need to see this." The photo was grainy, but the figure in the center was unmistakable, a tall, winged shadow against a backdrop of swirling mist. Its eyes glowed an unnatural crimson, piercing through the fog like twin embers. "Eve," I started, trying to mask my unease, "it's probably just a trick of the light. Some bird, an owl, maybe?" She shook her head vehemently. "No, Caleb. I saw it. It was, watching me. It didn't move, not at first. Just stood there in the fog, staring. Then it unfolded its wings and," her voice broke, and she clutched her arms as though warding off a chill. Evelyn wasn't prone to dramatics. She was the kind of person who kept her head when the rest of us lost ours. If she was scared, there was a reason. I decided to humor her. "Where did you see it?" "Old Carter's Bridge," she said. "Just after sunrise." That bridge had always had a sinister reputation. Spanning a narrow gorge just outside town, it was shrouded in mist most mornings. The locals called it the Devil's Passage. I'd dismissed the stories, until now. I grabbed my coat and camera. "Let's go." The bridge was deserted when we arrived, the morning fog curling thick and heavy around its steel supports. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant cry of a crow. "Right there," Evelyn whispered, pointing to the center of the span. "That's where it was." I scanned the area, my skepticism wavering. The air felt charged, as if the storm-heavy sky was pressing down on us. I raised my camera and snapped a few shots of the bridge, the mist swirling like ghostly tendrils. "Nothing," I said, lowering the camera. "Just fog." But Evelyn wasn't listening. She had stepped onto the bridge, her eyes locked on something I couldn't see. "Eve?" I called. She froze, her back to me. "Do you feel that?" A shiver ran down my spine. The air had gone impossibly cold, the kind of chill that sunk into your bones. Then I heard it, a low, almost imperceptible hum, like the thrumming of wings. "Evelyn, get back here." She turned, and the look on her face was one I would never forget. Pure, unbridled terror. "It's here." And then I saw it. Emerging from the fog, its wings spread wide, was the figure from the photo. Towering, inhuman, its eyes burned with an intensity that seemed to bore into my soul. The wings weren't like any bird's, they were leathery, almost bat-like, and spanned at least 10 feet. The hum grew louder, a vibration that seemed to resonate in my chest. Evelyn screamed, and the thing lunged, faster than I thought possible. I grabbed her arm, dragging her back toward the car as the creature's shadow loomed over us. We didn't stop running until we were back in town, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Evelyn collapsed onto the sidewalk, trembling. I could only stare at the horizon, where the mountains were now bathed in the amber light of dawn. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice hoarse. What was that?" I didn't have an answer. But as I looked down at the camera in my hands, I prayed that the photos would prove what we saw. I prayed that I wasn't losing my mind. What I didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The Mothman had come to Black Hollow. And it wasn't leaving. By the time we got back to the office, Evelyn was calmer, but her hands still shook as she cradled a cup of coffee. I reviewed the photos I'd taken on the bridge, hoping for something, anything, that would make sense of what we had witnessed. The images were sharp and vivid, but they told me nothing useful. The fog and early morning light obscured the details, but the silhouette of the creature was unmistakable. Those wide, dark wings. The glowing red eyes. A figure out of nightmares. "Caleb," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do now?" "We figure out what it is," I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed my own words. My instinct was to ignore it, to write it off as some bizarre hallucination, but the memory of that thing, its size, its eyes, made that impossible. I made a few calls to locals who knew the area well, starting with Jimmy Rhodes, the town historian. Jimmy had spent decades cataloging the strange and the forgotten in Black Hollow. If anyone had an answer, it was him. "Jimmy," I said when he picked up, "have you ever heard of a winged creature near Carter's Bridge?" There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "You talking about the devil bird?" "Devil bird?" I asked, suddenly feeling like a child asking about monsters under the bed. "That's what my grandpa used to call it," Jimmy said. "Said it lived in the holler and came out when something bad was about to happen. Death, mostly. Accidents, disasters, things like that. Superstition, of course, but," he trailed off. "But what?" "Well, some folks swear it's real. They say it's been seen around here for years. Never hurts anyone, but it doesn't have to. Seeing it's bad luck enough." I thanked him and hung up, my stomach churning. Bad luck. That didn't explain what Evelyn and I had felt on that bridge, raw, paralyzing fear. It wasn't just bad luck. It was something else, something ancient. That night, I pored over every story I could find about winged creatures and red eyes. The Mothman sightings in West Virginia stood out immediately. First reported in the 1960s near Point Pleasant, the creature was said to appear before a major disaster, the collapse of the Silver Bridge, which killed 46 people. The parallels were undeniable, but Black Hollow had no history of catastrophic events. What could it possibly be warning us about? Evelyn called around 10 p.m., her voice frantic. "It's back." "What? Where?" "Outside my house. Caleb, I think it's watching me." I was already grabbing my car keys. "Stay inside. Lock your doors. I'll be there in 10 minutes. The drive to Evelyn's house felt longer than it should have. The roads were nearly deserted, the streetlights casting pools of sickly yellow light on the asphalt. As I approached her neighborhood, I saw it, perched on a lamppost at the end of her street, its wings folded like a shroud. Its red eyes met mine. I slammed the brakes, heart pounding. The creature didn't move, didn't flinch. It just watched, unblinking, as if it had been waiting for me. I grabbed my camera from the passenger seat and fumbled to snap a photo. The flash went off, and in that instant, it unfurled its massive wings and launched into the sky. The wind from its ascent rocked my car. By the time I got out and aimed the camera again, it was gone, lost in the blackness above. Evelyn was pale when she opened the door, her hands clutching the frame like a lifeline. "Did you see it?" she asked. I nodded, stepping inside. "It flew off when I got here." We sat in her living room, the silence between us heavy. Her curtains were drawn tight, but she kept glancing toward the windows, as if expecting to see those crimson eyes staring back at her. "What does it want?" she whispered. "I don't know," I admitted. "But we're not the first to see it." I told her about the Mothman stories, about Jimmy's warnings, and the creature's supposed connection to disaster. Evelyn didn't say anything, but her eyes betrayed her growing dread. As midnight approached, I decided to head home. Evelyn insisted on keeping every light in her house on, and I couldn't blame her. On the drive back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow seemed too large, every flicker of movement at the edge of my vision too deliberate. When I arrived at my apartment, the voicemail light on my phone was blinking. There were no missed calls, and the number was unlisted. I hesitated before pressing play. The recording was garbled, distorted, but one thing was clear, a low, inhuman hum, rising and falling like the rhythm of beating wings. Then a voice, deep and guttural, whispered a single word. Leave. I deleted the message, my fingers shaking. Whatever was happening in Black Hollow, it wasn't finished with us. Not yet. The voicemail haunted me. I couldn't shake the deep, guttural tone of the word, leave. It wasn't just a warning, it was a command. The thought of packing up and disappearing from Black Hollow briefly crossed my mind, but where would I go? And how could I leave Evelyn behind? She'd already seen the creature up close, just like me. We were in this together, whether we liked it or not. The next day, I decided to confront Jimmy Rhodes in person. His mention of the devil bird had struck a chord, and I needed more answers. His home, an old cabin on the edge of the woods, was as eerie as the stories he told. The place was cluttered with books, jars of strange herbs, and enough taxidermy to make me feel like I'd stepped into a hunter's nightmare. Jimmy opened the door with a cigarette dangling from his lips. He squinted at me like I'd interrupted something important, though I doubted that was true. Caleb, he said, blowing out a plume of smoke. Didn't think I'd be seeing you so soon. You know why I'm here, I replied. Evelyn and I saw it again last night. It's not going away. Jimmy motioned me inside and poured us both a stiff drink. You're digging yourself a hole you can't climb out of, son, he said. You keep looking for this thing, it's gonna find you. It already has, I snapped. I need to know what it wants. What it is. Jimmy scratched at his wiry beard and sighed. A harbinger, if you believe the stories. It doesn't cause disasters, but it shows up right before one happens. Think of it like an omen, a shadow of what's coming. My grandpa swore he saw it the night before the mine collapsed back in 32. 34 men died that day. I leaned forward. But why here? Why now? There's no mine, no big factory, no dam about to break. Jimmy shrugged. Maybe it's not a disaster you're thinking of. Could be something worse. Worse? The word came out sharper than I intended. Ever hear of the Hollow Curse? Jimmy asked, his voice low. I shook my head. It's an old legend. Back when the town was founded, there were rumors about strange things in these woods. People disappearing, livestock mutilated. The settlers thought they'd angered some kind of spirit. They tried to appease it with offerings, but it never worked. After a while, they just stopped talking about it. But the sightings, those never stopped. I left Jimmy's cabin with more questions than answers. The Hollow Curse sounded like folklore, but folklore doesn't leave voicemails. I couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that something terrible was coming. That evening, Evelyn called me again, her voice trembling. There's something happening downtown, she said. People are talking about strange noises, like wings flapping and screams. I told her to stay put and grabbed my camera. The streets were eerily empty as I drove toward the town square, the usual chatter and activity replaced by an oppressive silence. When I arrived, I saw a small crowd gathered near the old clock tower. What's going on? I asked a man standing near the edge of the group. They're saying the clock struck 13, he whispered, his eyes darting around as if expecting the Mothman to descend from the sky. It's broken, though. Hasn't worked in years. A shiver ran down my spine. The clock striking 13 wasn't just a malfunction, it was an omen. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, their faces pale in the flickering light of the street lamps. And then, without warning, the lamps went out. The darkness was absolute. People screamed, fumbling for their phones or flashlights. I pulled out mine, but before I could turn it on, I heard it, the hum. It was the same sound from the voicemail, low and resonant, like the beating of massive wings. I looked up. There it was, silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. The creature hovered above the clock tower, its wings spread wide. Its eyes burned like molten embers, and its presence seemed to sap the air from my lungs. For a moment, no one moved. We were all frozen, transfixed by its otherworldly gaze. And then it screamed. The sound was like metal tearing, a high-pitched wail that pierced through the night and left us clutching our ears. The crowd scattered, people running in every direction. I stood rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away as the creature dived toward the ground. It landed with a deafening thud, its wings folding around its massive frame. I thought it would attack, but it didn't move. It just stood there, its head tilting slowly as if studying us. And then it spoke. Its voice was deep, guttural, and full of menace. "The time has come." The words echoed in my mind long after the creature launched itself back into the sky, disappearing into the darkness. The streetlights flickered back on, and the remaining townsfolk looked at each other, their faces etched with fear. Later that night, I returned to my apartment, shaken and exhausted. Evelyn called me again, but this time, she didn't sound scared. She sounded resigned. "Caleb," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't think we can stop this." "We don't even know what this is," I replied. There was a long pause. "Maybe we're not supposed to." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stared out my window, waiting for the red eyes to reappear in the dark sky. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, cutting through the stillness like a harbinger of its own. Whatever was coming to Black Hollow, it wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a promise. The days that followed were marked by unease, as if the entire town was holding its breath. People whispered of seeing shadows flit through the fog, of hearing unearthly hums in the night. Those brave enough to venture to the clock tower swore they could feel a pulsing beneath the ground, a faint tremor that seemed to grow stronger each day. Evelyn and I spent our time digging deeper into Black Hollow's history. The town's library became our sanctuary, its dusty archives a treasure trove of forgotten lore. What we found only deepened the mystery. One entry from a journal dated 1904 stood out. It described a previous sighting of the winged creature, eerily similar to ours. The writer, a local farmer named Gideon Tully, had claimed to see the red-eyed devil perched atop his barn just days before a devastating fire consumed half the town. He described the creature's appearance and its cryptic warning, "The reckoning is near." That phrase sent a chill down my spine. It was too similar to what the creature had said outside the clock tower, "The time has come." As Evelyn read aloud another account, this one from 1871, detailing a bridge collapse that killed dozens, I felt a creeping sense of dread. Every disaster in Black Hollow's history seemed to be preceded by a sighting of the creature. And every account ended the same way, with the writer disappearing or succumbing to mysterious circumstances. "This isn't just an omen," I said, slamming the journal shut. "It's part of the disaster." Evelyn nodded, her face pale. "But why? What does it want?" "I don't think it's here to warn us," I said, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. "I think it's here to make sure it happens." That night, as we pored over maps of the town, the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then, from outside, came the hum. We froze, listening as the sound grew louder, closer. I grabbed a flashlight and motioned for Evelyn to follow me to the window. Parting the curtain slightly, we peered out into the night. The streets were empty, but the fog seemed thicker, almost alive. Then, through the haze, we saw them, dozens of figures, their outlines barely visible in the dim light of the moon. They moved slowly, almost aimlessly, but there was something unnatural about the way they shuffled. "Are those people?" Evelyn whispered. I wasn't sure. The figures seemed wrong, their proportions slightly off, their movements too jerky. And then I saw it, hovering above the street like a silent sentinel, the Mothman. Its wings flapped slowly, sending ripples through the fog. Its eyes glowed brighter than before, casting an eerie red light over the figures below. They turned toward it, as if drawn to its presence. And then, as one, they stopped. The silence was deafening. I could feel Evelyn's grip tighten on my arm as we watched the figures slowly raise their heads to look directly at us. Their eyes glowed the same crimson as the creatures. "We need to go," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. I nodded, but before we could move, the Mothman turned its gaze to our window. It was as if the air had been sucked from the room. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then, with a sound like 100 beating wings, the figures and the creature vanished into the fog. By the time we reached the safety of my car, the streets were empty again. We drove aimlessly, our minds racing with questions and fears. We ended up at the bridge where Evelyn had first seen the creature, its steel frame now cloaked in an oppressive silence. "Why here?" Evelyn asked, her voice barely audible. I didn't have an answer. But as we stood there, staring into the fog, the ground beneath us began to shake. At first, it was subtle, barely noticeable. But it quickly grew stronger, the vibration sending ripples through the water below. "We have to get out of here," I said, grabbing Evelyn's arm. But before we could move, the bridge groaned, its supports buckling. A deafening crack split the air, and the center of the span collapsed into the gorge with a thunderous roar. The sound echoed through the valley, and as the dust settled, I realized the truth. This wasn't a warning. This was the beginning. Back in town, chaos erupted. News of the bridge collapse spread quickly, and people began to panic. The tremors hadn't stopped, and cracks were appearing in the streets and buildings. Some claimed to see figures moving through the fog, their eyes glowing red. Others swore they heard the Mothman scream, a sound that seemed to pierce their very souls. Evelyn and I returned to Jimmy's cabin, desperate for answers. But when we arrived, we found the door ajar, the inside ransacked. Jimmy was gone, and the only sign of a struggle was a single, clawed footprint etched into the floorboards. The creature was no longer just watching. It was hunting. That night, as I sat in my apartment, trying to piece together the events of the day, the voicemail light blinked again. My heart sank as I pressed play. The same guttural voice filled the room, but this time, the message was different. "You cannot stop it." The line went dead, leaving me in a silence more terrifying than any sound. The Mothman wasn't just a harbinger. It was the executioner. And the clock was running out. The town of Black Hollow was unraveling. The tremors grew stronger, splitting the streets and toppling buildings. The fog was no longer confined to the edges of town, it engulfed everything, suffocating and thick. Reports of glowing eyes in the dark multiplied, and whispers of disappearances spread like wildfire. But Evelyn and I were out of time for theories. The Mothman wasn't just heralding a disaster. It was the disaster. We made our way to the clock tower, the epicenter of the creature's last appearance. The streets were deserted, save for the occasional shadow that flickered just beyond the edge of visibility. Every step felt heavier, the weight of inevitability pressing down on us. "I don't think it's random," Evelyn said, her voice tight. "The bridge, the tremors, everything is pointing back here." She was right. The clock tower had been a silent witness to Black Hollow's history, standing tall through every calamity the town had faced. And now, its ominous presence felt like the heartbeat of whatever nightmare was descending on us. When we reached the base of the tower, the air was colder than it should have been. The door was ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed it open. Inside, the air was damp and filled with the scent of decay. The walls were covered in strange markings, claw-like gouges and spirals that glowed faintly in the dark. What is this? Evelyn whispered, running her hand over one of the spirals. I didn't have an answer. The markings seemed almost alive, pulsing faintly with an eerie light. They led upward, spiraling around the walls like a path. We need to go to the top, I said, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The stairs creaked under our weight as we climbed. The higher we went, the louder the hum became, a low, vibrating drone that seemed to resonate in my bones. By the time we reached the top, my head was pounding, and Evelyn looked pale and unsteady. The room at the top of the tower was empty, save for a massive crack in the floor that glowed faintly with the same light as the markings on the walls. It pulsed in rhythm with the hum, as if the tower itself were alive. And then we heard it. The scream. It wasn't just sound, it was a force, a wave of pure terror that drove us to our knees. I clutched my head as the air around us seemed to shatter like glass, the fog pouring into the room through unseen cracks. And there, emerging from the fissure in the floor, was the Mothman. Its wings unfolded slowly, its crimson eyes piercing through the haze. It stood taller than I remembered, its shadow stretching across the room like a living thing. It didn't move to attack, didn't make a sound. It simply stared. What do you want? Evelyn shouted, her voice raw with desperation. The creature tilted its head, as if considering her question. Then, for the first time, it spoke. You were warned. The voice was deep, resonant, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. The ground beneath us trembled violently, and the crack in the floor widened. Through it, I could see a swirling void, a chasm that seemed to stretch into infinity. This is your reckoning, it said. I pulled Evelyn to her feet, and we stumbled toward the stairs. The tower shook violently, and chunks of stone fell around us as the crack spread. By the time we reached the bottom, the fog was so thick we could barely see. The hum had become deafening, a pulse that seemed to synchronize with the trembling earth. Outside, the streets were in chaos. People ran in every direction, their screams mixing with the sound of collapsing buildings. And above it all, the Mothman soared, its wings casting shadows that seemed to devour the light. I grabbed Evelyn's hand, pulling her toward the car. We have to leave, now. But as we reached the vehicle, the ground beneath us buckled. The asphalt split open, and the car disappeared into the void. The fissures were spreading, swallowing everything in their path. There was no escaping it. No, Evelyn whispered, tears streaming down her face. This can't be how it ends. But it was. The Mothman circled above us, its eyes glowing brighter than ever. And then, with one final, earth-shaking scream, it dove toward the clock tower. The impact sent a shockwave through the town, flattening everything in its wake. The tower crumbled, disappearing into the chasm below. When I woke, the world was silent. The fog was gone, the air still. Black Hollow was no more, just a barren wasteland of cracked earth and scattered rubble. Evelyn lay beside me, unconscious but breathing. In the distance, I saw it. The Mothman stood on the edge of the horizon, its wings folded, its eyes dim. It watched us for a moment, then turned and disappeared into the void. Evelyn stirred, groaning softly as she sat up. Is it over? She asked. I didn't answer. I didn't know. All I knew was that we were alive, and Black Hollow was gone. But as we sat there, staring into the ruins of our town, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. The Mothman had come and gone, but its message lingered. You were warned.